All right, extended naturalism is here, a new approach to addressing the hard problem. Extended naturalism identifies 5 key problems associated with consciousness. And the first is the framing problem. And to understand the framing problem, we need to start with the core of the hard problem. How do we explain the particular processes by which particular arrangements of matter obtain this subjective experience of being in the world? If you listen to Dave Chalmers, you'll hear him frame it that way repeatedly. It's a very important framing. You have to know that the hard problem asks, why is it that subjective conscious experience arises in the context of this particular arrangement of matter? That's the essence of the hard problem. In essay 3, we address this. It looks like it is a central problem. And in fact, if you look at some of the top 10 problems in science, very often the hard problem will be listed 1, 2, or 3, always in the top 10. It seems to be a clear articulation of something that seems to be a bit of a mystery, and yet we're here to break it. The hard problem fundamentally is not, I'm here to say, after a year of study, I used to believe in the hard problem, but the hard problem is not properly framed. Extended naturalism is going to give us a different frame on thinking about the hard problem. Okay? It argues that it misframes the nature of the problem because it treats it as a single problem, when in fact there are 2 fundamentally different problem spaces that are masked by it. One of those problem spaces is the neurocognitive engineering problem. This is the problem of how neurocognitive activity relates to subjective conscious experience in animals with brains. And it seems, well, isn't that where consciousness is? And isn't brain the material, ergo? But no, there's a deeper or different philosophical problem, which is how we ontologically, like what's the real model of the world, align matter, whatever that is, the physical matter, and the consciousness mind or the conscious mind, and then epistemologically align that with our objective knowledge from the natural science and subjective and social forms of knowing. And this is what's called the Enlightenment gap. And notice that this has a different focus and structure, a philosophical structure, a structure about ontology, epistemology, and the right relationship between things like objective scientific knowing and subjective perspective. If you look at the consciousness literature and you utilize this lens, I encourage you to do so, because I think you will see very clearly with this lens, it will vacillate. You'll get philosophers and physicists talking about the potential of particular kinds of consciousness, and then you'll get neuroscientists and psychologists. Here, What Creates Consciousness at the World Science Festival, you see Dave Chalmers talking really about the Enlightenment gap, if you pay attention, and actually his partner, Anil Seth, is actually focused on the neurocognitive engineering problem when he actually calls the real problem of consciousness. John and I have done an essay that delineates why this is a mistake, in the sense that it shouldn't be named one thing. It should in fact be differentiated very clearly. Why is it 2 different problem spaces? Well, let's start with the basic structure. We have an explanatory gap. Obviously, we sit in the world as a first-person real perspective. This is Ernst Mach first-person drawing, so that gives a frame on that. And somehow when we look from the outside, we either see behavior or brains, and there's an explanatory gap in relationship to that. This is the old version of the problem, and then it gives rise to angles on what's it like to be a bat, which then enables us to really specify that it's the subjective qualitative experience of being that seems so hard to explain. And Dave Chalmers does a great job of articulating there have been advances in psychology, and give us a model that says there's a functional neuroinformation processing structure. These are neurocognitive functional structures. We can understand them, according to Dave Chalmers, from a standard mechanistic behavioral perspective, but what we can't understand is the phenomenal mind. So the hard problem is defined by the claim that we can separate the easy problems, and that we have a model of science that explains what mental processes are relative to behavior that leaves out the phenomenological mind. That's the essence of the hard problem, and then as it's framed, and then that's why we have hard relative to easy problems at their core. But is this an accurate claim, actually? Is it really the case that we have a model that understands science relative to mind and behavior, and minus some subjective qualities, that everybody agrees on and actually operates on? And the answer is no. And if the answer is no, then the entire argument that we can clearly delineate easy from hard becomes much, much more ambiguous. And I would argue that my work on the problem of psychology and John's work on analysis on equivocation on what mind means in cognitive science points very clearly that we don't actually have a really easy definition of mind minus subjective processes that clarifies the relationship between mind and behavior in a way that science can organize. So we can box the claim in and say, yes, there may well be an interesting set of questions to ask between the nature of neurocognitive activity and subjective conscious experience of being. But it is not the case that it's all easily tied together in a nice, tight little bag. I will argue very closely that the relationship between behavior and mind, whether you're talking about energy, are you talking about material behavior, or talking about living behavior, and where does mind emerge in relationship to behavior, mental processes, is not actually a clearly articulated. How does language relate to our phenomenological experience? Where do concepts come from in relationship to culture? How does science emerge out of concepts? How do we actually define things like neuroscience relative to psychology? And how do we actually even nest ourselves as subjects in relationship to the world? I'm going to argue that actually, no, it isn't the case that we can just specify, oh, here is the location. In fact, there is a problem of psychology, a problem of cognitive science that says there isn't a clear articulation of the relationship between science, mind, and behavior. There's a whole nest of philosophical questions around it. What does that mean? It means around the neurocognitive engineering problem, there is which we can delineate now within with the lens of extended naturalism, there is an Enlightenment gap. Okay, and these are two fundamentally different problem spaces. This is what I mean when I want to break the hard problem and say, are we talking about a philosophical problem or are we talking about a scientific problem? The philosophical problem, the Enlightenment gap, deals with metaphysical, ontological, epistemological questions pertaining to the so-called physical world, framed by natural science relative to concepts like mind, subjectivity, and awareness. The next talk with Alexander Bard is going to frame consciousness in a radically different way, sort of the metaphysics of subjectivity, which is a very different question than how brains give rise to felt experiences. And when we look at the model that we built, we have things like the tree of knowledge system, which represents knowing from a scientific behavioral perspective, the I-quad coin, which represents how you know as a specific human identity in the real world. These are two totally different vectors, I'll argue. And what's the language of science and what's the language of subject? These are the kinds of questions that the Enlightenment gap must deal with for a coherent knowledge structure. In contrast, the neurocognitive engineering problem says, what's the relationship between brains, neurocognitive activity, and subjective experiences in animals and humans? In the updated vocabulary of extended naturalism, and pointing to Neil Seth, this is called the real problem of mind too, and things like behavioral investment theory, John's recursive relevance realization, justification systems theory, all of these apply to this kind of question. Why has this been so hard? Like, why aren't we clear? And part of the reason is it turns out that natural science has been mind blind. There's a whole set of reasons as to why this is, but fundamentally, what I mean by this is natural science does not know how to see mind in nature. How do we know this? Well, one way is we know because of the problem of psychology. How can we make this clear? Well, extended naturalism makes it clear because it says we have been failed to define what mind is. There is a reference to the extended mind. In fact, Chalmers himself worked with Clark on that. And 4E cognitive science has evolved to argue that actually we need to get away from certainly formal representational information processing models and situate the mind as a complex adaptive system that's embodied in an organism, embedded in its environment and history, enacts behavioral repertoires in situational context. This is an extended mind. What EN does is it says, where is the extended mind in nature? And it clarifies it as mindedness. Mindedness is a third dimension of complexification that's been missing, which has resulted in big picture views of science and naturalism being mind blind. And EN points to the need to correct this grammar of our world. And fundamentally, ultimately, what we're on offer here is actually a whole new science, a new way to organize psychology, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science into a science of human mindedness. Can we see this? Absolutely. Take big history views, take the big hit picture view from Sean Carroll, take Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Anything, and a whole bunch of other things, perhaps most obviously articulated by Holmes Rolston III. And the model for many of nature is just three big bangs. and this consolidates it. There's one, a matter-energy dimension, then a life, biology, flora, fauna dimension, and then finally the mind's, human mind's Big Bang. But when we take a tree of knowledge extended ontology, we see this is actually just not right. It's yes, we can map up the matter object dimension coming off of a Big Bang there. And yes, we can see the evolution of life and living organismic complexity. And yes, we can see the culture person plane of existence. But what's missing here? The animal mind plane is completely missing. Of course, Aristotle had this, has a sensory motor looping system. He had 4 layers in his scales of nature. We've lost this. We became mind blind. And the tree of knowledge and our extended ontology allows us to see it. There have been 4, not 3, Big Bangs, and I can't tell you how important that difference is. So here we are, folks. There's a framing problem. It isn't just one problem. It's a neurocognitive engineering problem and an Enlightenment gap problem. And secondarily, why has this been so hard to see? Because we've been mind blind. We've got to reshift. This fundamentally means the question about what do we mean by nature, how do we model nature, and how do we model nature in a way that's consistent with science has to be addressed. Extended naturalism brings 3 different arguments, many of which have been developed by John, and we're about ready to turn it over to him. An argument of extended consistency that says, hey, the logic of science says that we need a model that includes science as a real thing. Extended emergence clarifies the dimensions upon which we think about the emanation, emergence, and a continuity, discontinuity dialectic, and an extended ontology, which we just pointed to, the tree of knowledge. So that is where we are. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to stop there. We will pick this up afterwards, but that's the frame. And now John's going to take us on a journey to talk about extended consistency and a whole bunch of other things. So, John, I'll turn it over to you.
That was wonderful, Greg. You continually remind me why I love working with you. So,
Awesome.
I'm not going to do more than a brief review of the arguments I've already made. There's the, hopefully some of you have attended the previous conference. It's online and available. There's the essays that Gregg has written and I vetted. What I want to do instead is concentrate on what's new, what's sort of on the cutting edge of my tinkering. I hope it's more than tinkering with some of these arguments and a proposal for one more sort of tightening move that can be made. So I'm going to do this in 3 ways. We're going to say what's new, at least since the previous conference. What's new about the claim of extended consistency? What's new there? What are we talking about? Then second, what's new, especially because of recent work by Eric Hole, Causal Emergence 2.0, that's the title of the paper, from March of 2025. So how's that for recent, eh? So that's right on the cutting edge. And that's going to give us a way of tightening up and developing what's meant by extended emergence and more clearly delineating how it is between the traditional dichotomy of weak and strong emergence. And that gives us a new space wherein we can talk about and theorize about consciousness. And then the next is I'm going to talk about a new dimension of extended naturalism that is the crux of the epistemological ontological interface. This is what I've been thinking the most about most recently. And namely, this is the whole issue about intelligibility and its relationship to our sense of realness, because this is a guiding normative standard for both our ontology, where we say real, and for our epistemology, where we say true. And so that's why I want to really home in on that. Okay, so for the quick review, and I apologize if you find it a little too quick, but there's a lot out there already. And if I were to redo all the previous arguments, that would be my talk. And so I can't do that. Okay, so the argument for, I gave an argument largely for the structure of extended naturalism. It's not completely accurate. Gregg and I are kind of like Lennon and McCartney. I tended to concentrate more on the structure, and then Gregg filled in the content with his amazing descriptive metaphysics and meta-theoretical framework. But of course, he tinkers with the structure and I tinker with the content and so on and so forth. But that's largely what I'm going to address here. I'm going to address the structural aspects. So there was 2 parts to the argument for extended naturalism. One was an argument for an extension of the formal requirement of consistency And then that was integrated with an extended sense of emergence, making use of an integration of the work on causal emergence by Eric Hole and Licio Ueraro's work, contrasting bottom-up causation and top-down constraints, where causes shape actuality and events, and constraints can shape probability, possibility into probability, dispositions, conditional relations, etc., like that. Um, so, uh, what I want to do is build on what was already implicit, which was we were addressing epistemological and ontological concerns in an integrated manner right from the very beginning. The consistency is epistemological and the emergence is ontological. And right from the beginning, we were addressing them in an integrated fashion. I want to now explicate that and build on that. Okay. So, as Gregg noted, I had argued last time consistency needed to be extended to what is presupposed by the natural science. So it's not just derived from them. And this was important because we had to talk about the real information, the real measurement, and the real scientists that are presupposed in the practice of science. And we needed an account of consistency that would extend to those presuppositions. And so what we were actually, I would now talk about it as, is this is not just a logical consistency. We were trying to articulate a consistency in the attribution of realness. I think that's what we're actually were trying to do, right? And of course, realness is a comparative judgment. And you see that at work in sort of everyday reductionism, where people will say it's nothing but, that's a comparative movement, it's nothing but, love is nothing but chemicals in the brain, right? So, and that's actually an attempt to give an attribution of realness via a comparison, whereas the love is illusory, less real in comparison to the neurochemical that is more real. And I didn't really articulate that, but now I think the first point is making very clear that what we're talking about here, when we're talking about extended consistencies, we're talking about a consistency in the attribution of realness, which works in a comparative fashion. And this is why I'm going to focus later on intelligibility and realness. So I think that's an important thing. Now, based on an argument that I've been developing since 1997. And what is that date from a galaxy far, far away and a long time ago? That's from my thesis, The Naturalistic Imperative in Cognitive Science, which converged with the recent excellent book, The Blind Spot, from 2024 by Frank Gleiser, my good friend Evan Thompson, both all of whom devoted an entire chapter to relevance realization, which is dear to my heart, and so very, very much grateful for that. Thank you very much. And then also from work from Whitehead, who's had a huge influence on me about this more and more as I try and get not into what Whitehead was saying, but how he was saying it. That has been an increasing influence on me, which is what we need to add to extended consistency. And in fact, in order to get better at coherence and consistency in the attribution of realness, is that we are with extended consistency, we're not trying to avoid just logical propositional inconsistency. We are also trying to avoid what is called a performative contradiction. And that's what was implicit in the work. So a performative contradiction is where one state or status, I'm going to just hold those two together. They're different, but the difference doesn't matter for the argument. Where one state or status, right, contradicts the statement that one is making. So here's a non-controversial performative contradiction. I am right now currently completely unconscious. All right. The state I'm in means I have to be conscious, which contradicts what I'm actually stating. It's not impossible or metaphysically impossible for me to be unconscious. I frequently am, but there's a performative contradiction in that statement. More specifically, for our purposes, what we need is a scientific worldview that ontologically homes as real the very practice of science, that can really deeply say science really exists, and therefore the pronouncements made from science to other levels of reality can be held as consistently real. Okay, so that's the basic argument. I had talked about this before, but I had not properly explicated it, which is what I'm trying to do now. Part of an elaboration is an explication. But now I want to add that second feature explicitly. Sorry, the second and third feature. That we're talking about a consistency in the attribution of realness, and that highlights the importance of avoiding performative contradiction. All right? Please remember that. Next, I had argued based on the work by Hole, Uraro, and Wolfgang Smith, the measurement problem. I'm not going to repeat those arguments. They're extant. You can consult them. For real, that is causal emergence, where when we're talking about different levels and where the one level is seen to emerge from a lower level, these are all metaphors, of course, that we're not talking about something merely epiphenomenal or merely epistemic in nature. Well, that's the way we have to talk, but that's not the way it really is. We're talking about causal emergence, and I take it as axiomatic that causation is one of the defining features of real. We can, of course, quibble about that in some philosophical level, but that's a quibble that's going to undermine all the science that is participating in the discussion of consciousness. So I'm just going to assume that as I think it's fair to say everybody else does, other than perhaps I know, because even the idealists have to have a notion of real causation, and that was Schelling's critique, and I could go into that right now, and I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so Hole has recently, as I said, March 2025, updated and tightened his argument. It's a very impressive paper. The original 2013 paper, very impressive. There were critical responses to it. He has responded extremely well, and he's making a much more rigorous argument, much tighter. He's replacing running off sort of just information theory. He replaced it with running off an axiomatic notion of causation, really tightening the argument in a very, very powerful way. Now, it's not an easy paper. You don't take it to the beach, okay? But it is nevertheless, I think, really well done. So what Hole has done is to point to a consilience. Notice what I said there. Powerful term. That's the term he uses, and he's got justification for it. I can't give that whole argument. Please read the paper. He's pointed to a consilience in philosophy and in science, and therefore between philosophy and science, about about causation involving two causal primitives. Now, it might be that there are more, but that's not needed for his argument. There are these two causal primitives. The first is necessity. Necessity means how unique some event is as a cause. How unique is that event? If like here's something that is the unique cause, right? That's necessity. If there are multiple possible causes for that, the necessity of any one of those causes goes down. Okay? So notice what's being done here. It's an interesting use. Sufficiency is how unique is the effect produced by the cause. So here's the cause. Does it produce one effect reliably, or can it produce many different effects? Okay? And then the idea here, these are really, really basic notions, and we have to thank him for sort of really getting them very concisely put together. So both necessity and sufficiency can be measured by a probability where uniqueness is 100%. So if it is completely unique, then it's 100% necessary. If it's completely sufficient, it's 100% sufficient. And then you can count, right, by the distribution. Like, well, no, it turns out that not only A can cause B, but C and D can all. Then you can count, and as you count, you get a probability distribution for the uniqueness of the necessity or the sufficiency, which means you can actually compute, you can calculate, you can do a score on a continuum of how much necessity and uniqueness, necessity and sufficiency any X has. So here's a system, or here's some level of a system, and here's some event in the world. How much necessity and sufficiency does it have? So you can measure the causal relevance of any x in terms of this score of, right, the causal primitives of necessity and sufficiency. It's a really brilliant uh, formalization. Now, I don't think that's sufficient for causal relevance. Um, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But I think he's really picked up on something that is axiomatically necessary for causal relevance. And notice it's a comparative, which is what we need for realness. One thing can have more causal relevance, can have a greater causal primitive score than another thing. Okay. Given this powerful measure, you can now calculate different scales for some system. So here's the micro level, like maybe it's the electronic level of a computer, and then here's a meso level, right, of sort of the motherboard and stuff like that. Here's another level up of the software, maybe another level, the interaction between the computer and the environment, so forth. So what you can do is you can measure at all these different scales and determine the causal relevance of each scale very cleanly, very cleanly. Now you get two. I think there'll be more results, but the two results he really zeroes in on in his paper is the clear. It's basically a proof. That's how tight it is. No one level carries all the causal relevance. That just is not true. So the sort of Enlightenment wet dream that we could find the level from which everything can be explained doesn't turn out to be right when we actually formalize our judgments of causal relevance and our attribution therein of realness. Like that, just savor that for a minute. That's really powerful. Okay. Now, because you're talking about causal relevance, and there's an argument I hear, but I could make, but I don't have time. I hope you get it intuitively. We're also talking about the real information. Each level has a unique capacity to produce real information that is not available at the other level. Causation is the ontology, information is the epistemology, but they are integrated in the notion of the attribution, the measurement of of relevance, and thereby the attribution of realness. Okay. The second finding, which is entailed by the first, but nevertheless is important to explicitly state, the higher macro levels have significant causal relevance because they generate powerful increases in, right, the measurement of the causal primitives. Okay. Now, why might that be the case? Hole doesn't do it in this paper, but he did it in the first paper. It's because you have to think about causation and information together in terms of communication, one event communicating with another, one part of a system communicating with other, and you need higher level properties in order for communication to occur. For example, you need redundancy. You need multiple things going from A to B because you'll lose information and causal connectedness, Einstein, right? If you don't have the redundancy because of the irremovability of noise. More recently, there's been work that it adds to this, and Hole's aware of it because he's done work on the integrated information theory of consciousness for what is known as synergistic information. Synergistic information is that you have A and B sending signals to C, and C will produce a signal that is not the result of any additive relationship between A and B, but a synergistic relationship. Okay. What that means, and you need this to by the way, to do good analyses of things like even neural networks. So this is grounded well. These higher level properties of redundancy and synergy are important. And here's where the integration with Yorero comes in. We are looking at the ways in which the conditions have to be constrained in order for the causation to occur. The conditions that have to be constrained in place as we metaphorically say, in order for the causation to occur. Okay? Now, what gets really cool here is some of the language he starts to use. He says, when we're looking at a system, well, we're actually, every level is actually a slice of a hyper object. That's his term, a hyper object. And here we can hear the work of Merton, of course. But of course, we can hear the work of Michael Levin, the hyper objects. I don't know if Mike's here attending this talk or not. And this is properly Platonic. I mean, do you get it? You think you're seeing this, but what it is a hyperdimensional hyper object. That's the reality of it. And you download particular slices or aspects of it into your particular experience at a particular time for a particular purpose. What it is in itself is something like a Platonic eidos. And I think that's wickedly cool. And if for some of you are wondering why, take a look at the argument I gave for strong transcendence, and you can see why having a place wherein we can integrate Neoplatonism, a post-Kantian, post-Einsteinian, post-for ecog sci Neoplatonism. Okay. Now, the thing to note about this form of emergence that Hull's talking about, and whenever we say emergence, we now, given the argument, have to say emanation, because the level that emerges is not epiphenomenal. It carries real causative power and real information. So emergence and emanation are intrinsically bound together. This, of course, is a Neoplatonic point. Now, what's important about this notion then is we can have a proper place for the system of things. Notice what I'm doing here. We call science. There is an ontological place for science. Science emerges with causal powers as science and an access to information as science, which of course is what science presupposes. But now we can say why. What kind of worldview, what kind of ontology do we need in order to say that? Now, the point about this is neither, right? So philosophers had created a dichotomy. I've learned to distrust all dichotomies, especially the ones given to us by the Enlightenment or versions of the Enlightenment. I've got other courses online that make that argument. Okay, so what we have here is the usual dichotomy. So let me just be clear. A distinction is a logical difference that is pragmatically useful for conceptual purposes. Okay? A dichotomy says, no, this is an ontological, real difference in reality itself. Okay? I'm not saying we shouldn't use distinctions. That would be stupid, and I hope I'm not stupid. But what I'm saying you shouldn't do is slide from the usefulness of a distinction, its pragmatic usefulness, its conceptual usefulness, into an ontological conclusion about a dichotomy. So the dichotomy was between strong emergence, in which the lower level somehow emerges, but there's no explanatory link, and therefore we have some kind of dualism, either substance or property dualism, and I won't get into that, okay? And then most people would acknowledge, who reject dualism, would acknowledge that there's emergence, like how water emerges out of hydrogen and oxygen, but it's weak emergence because we can totally reduce the explanation at the level of water to the explanation at the level of hydrogen and oxygen. We have a reductive explanation. It's weak because it's epistemically useful to talk about the wetness of water, but all we're doing is some sort of data compression. We're not picking up anything in reality. And therefore, we're back to flatland physicalism, and the weak emergence doesn't give you any kind of dualism or any kind of levels of reality. Causal emergence is neither strong emergence nor weak emergence. There is an explanatory relation between the levels, but it is non-reductive. there is consistency. In fact, if you read causal emergence 2.0, that's part of the methodology. You cannot posit any way of carving up a higher level that is inconsistent with how you mathematically carve up the lower level. They're consistent in that fashion, but it is non-reduction. Why? Because the consistency doesn't mean there isn't unique causal power and informational realness at the upper level. Okay, it splits the difference really powerfully. This is why we call it extended emergence, trying to indicate how strongly, bad pun, it is between strong and weak emergence. With this further work by Hole and also further work by Urero, she has a new book out too, Context Changes Everything. This position is getting stronger and stronger, to my mind at least, to the mind of many people. It helps us to further develop a point I argued for in previous UTOK. Okay, but I'm going to try and get this a little bit more explicit and clear and tighten it up and get back into the issue of intelligibility and realness. So reductionism presupposes two things. It presupposes that intelligibility equals generalizability, right? So the basal level is the most highly generalizable, and therefore, since generalizability is how we generate intelligibility, it's the most intelligible, and the most intelligible is the most real. And of course, running through that is the idea that realness is a judgment of comparative intelligibility. Okay, that's one of the presuppositions. The second is that prediction, and I do this because Hole talks about this in the paper, prediction is sufficient for explanation. If we think of explanation as the process by which we generate epistemic access or perhaps generate intelligibility, I won't get into the ontology about that right now, right? Then you think all I need is the most generalizable predictions, and that will get me the most intelligibility. Okay, that's the machine that justifies reductionism. There's lots of variations on it. Yeah. Kim's work and stuff like that. But that, I will argue, is the core machine. But what Hole's work shows, notice the language I'm using, is that intelligibility is not just prediction, right? It's the tightness of the causal relevance. It's causal fittedness. We're not talking just about truth. We're talking about relevance. We're talking about not just accuracy, we're talking about precision. That's what we're trying to do when we're giving an explanation. We're not just trying to generate truth, we're trying to generate relevant truth. Okay? This is convergent with earlier work by Yablo. One of the things I thought I was going to do for this talk, but I can't because it's too big, is I want to integrate Yablo's earlier work on causal relevance, where he talks about how causes and effects have to be proportional with each other with what I'm doing right now. But I want to give credit because it's inspiring what I'm doing here. Okay? Intelligibility is grounded in complexification. That's what it's grounded in, right? This integration of integration, differentiation, compression, particularization, right, etc. And what's exciting, right, is that complexification also points, well, I'll make an argument that it points towards the fact, the other idea about what an explanation is. So explanation was prediction, and then what people tried to sort of build on top of that was computational coherence. I have a computationally coherent model that generates the prediction. And that's all it is to explain something. That's all it is to disclose intelligible realness. Okay. Now, what's important with Hole's work is we get a really clear way of measuring complexity, not the merely verbal, simultaneously integrating and differentiating, which I myself have used. We get a formalization. How do you formalize it? You measure how much each level, right, participates to increasing causal relevance. If a lot of levels contribute, complex. If very few levels contribute, not complex. There you go. It's kind of like, it's like, whoa, that's really cool. What, of course, you're measuring is integration across levels and differentiation between levels. Of course. Okay. All right. Now, now moving beyond whole, I take it as fundamental following Polanyi and work done on Polanyi by people like Esther Lightcap Meek in her book Contact with Reality, that realness is some improvement in right? It's a comparative improvement in intelligibility. The stick is more real than the shadow because I can use the stick to explain the shadow and not the shadow to explain the stick. There's more information available in the shadow. In the stick. The stick has more causal interactions possible to it, et cetera, et cetera. You see how it fits in this model very, very well. Okay. The important point to note, though, is that that improvement is both quantitative, right? You get more powerful predictions, but also qualitative in terms of causal realness, the causal relevance. And so we're talking about, again, like I said, complexification across levels as an important way of talking about the comparative improvement in intelligibility, causal relevance, prediction, and increased information availability. Now, what does all that mean? And I suppose Alexander Bard is going to like the next sentence, the next proposition a lot. Realness is best disclosed dialectically, not reductively. You have to do the integration between levels, between integration and differentiation, compression, particularization. You're balancing off, right, prediction. You're integrating prediction and causal tightness, causal relevance. And there's no one level you can settle it on. There's no one level. This is what we mean when there is an emergence emanation dialectic. We're not talking epistemically or even just epistemologically. We're talking ontologically. That's the argument I've just made to you. Now, Alexander might not like, I don't know if I wouldn't say it's identical to the Hegelian dialectic. I think it is very close to the Neoplatonic dialectic. And then he and I can argue at some point, what's the relationship between the Neoplatonic and the Hegelian? And I think Schelling plays a very crucial role in that potential future debate and discussion. But right now, we'll put aside German idealism until Alexander gives his talk. So it's not reduction alone that needs to be rejected as we develop an extended intelligibility. That's what I'm now proposing to you. An extended intelligibility, that by which we make judgments about realness. Okay. Let's avoid, following the dictates argued for, let's avoid a fundamental performative contradiction about intelligibility. Let's avoid a fundamental performative contradiction about intelligibility. So I hope that's not coming through. They're building something next door. I think it's just an institute for noise production, but they claim it's condominiums. All right. So way back when, at some of the more 20th century fundamental work on statistics, Savage, that's the guy's name. Sorry, Savage made a fundamental, and he thought it was fundamental, distinction between a large world for statistical purposes and a small world. Now, the large world is ultimately the real world. The large world has real uncertainty in it, not just measurable risk. Now, why does that become even more pertinent? If you have real emergence, you have real ontological uncertainty. Real emergence entails real uncertainty. I don't know until it's emerged. Okay? And that goes well into L.A. Paul's notion about transformative experiences within philosophy and psychology. There's another bridge point there. I can't pick it up right now. The large world is, right, ill-defined because it's combinatorially explosive. The amount of information is hyperdimensional. Okay? And it has radical novelty, also an implication of real emergence. Now, the worlds we work with in cognition, and especially in our computational calculations, when we try to actually do statistics, for example, in Savage's case, are small worlds. A small world is a world in which there is no uncertainty. There can be certain measurements of probabilistic risk, but that's not uncertainty, right? It is not ill defined. A small world is essentially well defined. Okay. And novelty is not present. Okay. Because if it was present, then your computational system would break down because it would fail to be completable over your predictions. Now, what Savage was pointing out is there's always something behind the application of statistics or statistical modeling, like in the LLMs, by the way, which is the process by which the large world is right formalized and framed into a small world. That's always the case. Okay. Now, picking up on this and a paper that we're still trying to get published, Anna Riedel and I, on rationality and relevance realization, a paper that is published in Frontiers I think it's Frontiers in Psychology, in 2024, a paper with Johannes Jaeger, Alex Vervaeke, a student of mine, and Riedel, a student of mine, Dennis Walsh, a colleague of mine, philosophy biology at the University of Toronto, and myself on naturalizing relevance realization. It's naturalizing relevance realization, why relevance realization is fundamentally not computational. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at it. What's the number of small worlds? The number of small worlds is infinite. Okay. The number of small worlds, this is a version of Reichenbach, Reichenbach's argument. Okay. I take that as non-controversial. Okay. Uh, each small world is necessarily different from another small world, because if it was necessarily the same, then it would actually be one small world. It would be one unified formal system. Okay. There is no computational way to go from one to another, by the way. Uh, you can't compute from one logic to another, for example. Okay. Therefore, given all those three, there is no essence, a set of necessary and sufficient shared features running through all of the small worlds. Okay. There's no way a priori to formalize the process of generating a small world. That's a direct implication. Okay? To put it now more succinctly, the process of formalization cannot itself be formalized. You would have to generate the infinite acts of formalization and then do the impossible of finding a shared essence running through all of them. You can't do it. You can't do it. Okay? This is why the idea that what science is doing is giving us sort of this computationally coherent and complete thing isn't right either. Okay, this is why people in philosophy of science are not talking about even a scientific method. They talk about scientific methods. And of course, Gregg has been the person that has labored the most to try and, yeah, but how do we put all that together in a descriptive metaphysics that means we're not talking past each other or undermining each other? I think we can now see a little bit more the ontological depth of what he was wrestling with. And thank God for Gregg. Okay, so small worlds intrinsically involve a constitutive relationship to the large world, which is not itself formalizable. Okay? So the formalization stands between a formal system and that which can never be captured by a formal system, and that relation itself can't be formalized. That's powerful. Now, the argument is what's doing that is relevance realization, and I won't go into that argument at depth. Please read the paper. Um, um, the point is relevance realization, while it can show and work within computation, it cannot be reduced to computation. Okay. So not only is there no privileged level to which everything can be reduced, there is no computational formalization of the processes running through intelligibility of the process, relevance realization. Do you see? The goal of reduction, reduce everything to generalizability prediction, which we capture in a computationally coherent model, it doesn't work. It doesn't track the ontology or the cognition of intelligibility. These conclusions about causal relevance and relevance realization and their relationship to intelligibility and realness point to a deep connection between relevance realization and causal relevance and realness and intelligibility. So this means that the classic computational binaries given to us by the Enlightenment, much bemoaned by postmodernism. I hope Brendan's here. All right. All those dichotomies should be collapsed. Now, thankfully, we don't have to do that because you know what's already happened? They've been collapsed. All of the fundamental dichotomies of collapse and work by Quine and Putnam and Duham and just ongoing work in the philosophy of science. Aspects of Truth by Pickard has a great survey of all of these arguments. I'm going to take one that's really important for consciousness. And they're, well, two, they're together, which is fact value, fact, objectivity, value, subjectivity, right? And as Desmond eloquently argues, that's the engine for nihilism, because what you get is a valueless reality that we project subjective and therefore not real value on, within which we are just an insignificant, valueless thing. That's nihilism. It's ready to go. It's ready to go, and that's the meaning crisis, right? But the thing you have to do, and this is what's Putnam's move, is you have to ask yourself, not what is a value, which is what we concentrate on, because we presume that we know what a fact is. A fact is a single statement picking out a single state of affairs, and they correspond. Okay, so first of all, the correspondence theory is like, bleh. Okay, so like that's just been really difficult to get any purchase on. But I don't need that argument, although I think that argument is germane, right? There is no single level description. There is no single description of this. There is no signal, right? And there is therefore no one cognitive state I'm in. There are no single propositions corresponding to single. There is a causal tapestry out there, hyper objects and the space of all hyper objects, and I slice some piece of that out in terms of causal relevance that I then process with relevance realization within a propositional network. All of that involves judgments of relevance. Now I ask you, is relevance a fact or a value? Well, it's a value. Really? Can't you get it wrong? You do it all the time. Your moment of all those moments of insight you have are realizations that your judgments of relevance were wrong. They didn't pick up on what was, notice what you'll say, actually relevant in the situation. Oh, well, then relevance is an objective fact of the universe. So this has 17 grams of relevance in it or something like that. That doesn't work either. This is what I mean when I say relevance is transjective. The fact value distinction doesn't work because we don't know. We don't have any ontology that supports the fact value dichotomy. We can make distinctions, and we should, but the ontological dichotomy is not supportable. And the first, the distinction, does not legitimate the second, the dichotomy. Okay. So, what does that mean? I've developed more what's meant by extended consistency, brought in performative contradiction, more what's meant by extended emergence on the work on causal emergence, developed and explicated more. Sorry, I meant also attribution of realness for extended consistency. and then developed this notion of extended intelligibility realness, which goes with consistency as the attribution of realness. And that is exactly the interface between the epistemology and the ontology. Okay. Intelligibility realness is located in complexification disclosed by an ultimately non-computational dialectic that breaks through enlightened dichotomies like subjective, objective, and fact value, and discloses a more profound kind of intelligible realness and makes a powerful place without performative contradiction, a locus that is performatively consistent with the existence and function of consciousness. Thank you very much.
All right. Beautiful, John. And I am reminded why I like working with you, and folks will get a flavor for the little dialectic here, as John has more of a philosopher training background, and I'm a psychotherapist training background, but I think it's a beautiful blend and mix. The structure of that was deep and profound, friend. And I'm feeling its richness, as I did last time, ground the depth and profundity of the structural argument. So some of that was new for me, and I'm moved by it, and that was awesome. So we're going to continue because we got a lot to cover, and then we'll hit, and again, the flavor will shift. I'm shifting us back to content, in the sense that, my ground is psychotherapy into psychology, into philosophy. And what I have found in this journey over the last year is a way to enrich my own understanding of my own consciousness, which I had spent a fair amount of time on. But the clarity and structure and function argument that has evolved, and the clarity of the language argument that has evolved over the last year, has really made an impact on me, similar to the impact that happened when I started to really see the problem of psychology and how to fix it. A basic transformation is happening with me in relationship to the problem of consciousness. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the screen, and pick up where John left off, return to this, and articulate for you a content perspective on how to think about human consciousness, in a way that enables us to get a lot more clear on relationship to what it is that we're looking at here. So, I think somebody's drawing on the screen of that. Hold on one second. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can, hold on one second. If I stop sharing and go to that. Okay, I'll share again. Okay. So we're talking now of a theory of mind 2 in humans, and I definitely want to emphasize the fact that we are focused in this talk on the concept of mind 2, and there's a terminology there that I want to be emphasizing in humans that I want to be emphasizing. And this is going to then, my hope is that one of the things that extended naturalism is going to attempt to do is going to clarify our language, and clarify what we're talking about in relation. So this gets us oriented towards what we call the definition problem, which is how exactly are mind and consciousness defined and placed in relationship to each other in the natural world. And one of the things that Ian does is give us extended definitions that unpacks consciousness and gives us a way to frame mind in relationship to consciousness and the natural world. These are all characterized in essay 6. I've done a blog on this, we've talked about this, so I'm going to be very quick, but fundamentally this consciousness packs in all sorts of different meanings, and we absolutely need to get clear on 3 different references. 1, creature consciousness, the functional awareness and responsivity of organisms broadly defined in relationship to their environment. We could see this the way they participate in the environment, the way they elicit procedures in particular thing, the intelligence that they show. At the same time, in seeing that does not necessarily mean or point to or certainly raises questions about what we mean by subjective conscious awareness, the felt experience of being in the world, the location of the hard problem. And then, of course, there's self-conscious awareness, recursion on subjectivity in some way, and in humans' capacity to narrate that awareness. So those are our three definitions. We've used the tree of knowledge to zoom in and allow us to see mindedness in a way that other systems have not, an ontology. And of course, that's grounded in UTOK's and extended naturalism's tree of knowledge system. And I've talked about the parable of the cats to see mindedness. You have a dead cat, an anesthetized cat, and a living and a live cat. Drop them all out of a tree. A living and live cat behaves very differently than the dead and anesthetized cat. The anesthetized cat shows biophysiological organization. Inside of it, the dead cat's decaying, and the live cat jumps and lands on its feet and runs away. Remarkably, we've never specified that kind of behavior as being minded or mental behavior. We just call it behavior in psychology, one of the great errors that I discovered in relationship to the history of the field. We did that in large part because of the Enlightenment gap, where we're splitting mind and matter. Oh, we can see it out here. It must be behavior matter, and it must be different than what's behind it as mind. But ultimately, the entire system, that's the extended mind, is that we need to think systematically about the level of complexification, the intelligibility at the level of causation that's relevant for what it is that we're trying to understand with precision, to use some of John's terminology. So we need to shift fundamentally from this behind the scenes mind that somehow is separate from the world into mindedness that's a complexification layer across a vertical dimension. And mindedness refers to functional awareness and responsivity that animals with complex brains and active adaptive bodies have in 3D behavioral space. I'll point to that from Michael Levin, as opposed to, say, morphological space, which is taking place at the life organism layer behind me. Again, notice scaling of complexification is crucial to get the right relevance. This is happening via a sensory motor loop. I've got muscles and senses and a nested hierarchy that affords me to behave fundamentally different than plants, who are behaving with functional awareness and responsivity, as are bacteria. But we can readily observe that the behavior of animals, this is the parable of cats in a tree, do behave radically differently than other animals, other organisms. They operate in 3D behavioral space. And we can use the tree of knowledge and categorize the various behavior patterns of complexification in relation. I'm doing a dangerous thing here, doing a little bit of ladder scaling of complexification. I think you want to be very sensitive to that. And at the same time, there's certainly some truth to that. And of course, we have the capacity as cultured persons to narrate and dialogue, which I do believe is a fundamentally different layer of complexification. And we can use Michael Levin's concept of light cones in the ways in which organisms develop goals and have possibilities and concerns. And I would argue the light cone of cultured persons is different than quote unquote higher animals, different than lower animals like slugs, and that's different than bacteria. And that relates to the size of the cones in the tree of knowledge. So with our frame of mindedness as a third dimension of complexification, we can then shift in and zoom in into the map of mind. My analysis of psychology identifies 4 different domains of mindedness that have to be considered. Mind is behavior, mind is neurocognitive functional activity, mind is subjective conscious experience, and mind is self-conscious reasoning. Here's the map. Outside overt behavior, which you can film, mind 1B, mindedness in the world from the outside that exists between the animal and the environment. There's the hidden neurocognitive structure. Notice I say neurocognitive. There's a brain in there. There's a biological level of complexification. We can zoom in just neuroscience down into neurons themselves, but then there's a communication connectome that's communicating semantic information. That communication connectome is neurocognitive activity of mind 1A. And then somehow we get the emergence of mind 2, and that's where our focus will be. But in humans, we want to be clear when we talk about mind 2, we have access to mind 3, where you can all introspect. And we can narrate privately. Hey, dude, I think that's a cool nap. While we narrate publicly and maybe have privately. I'm not sure I get all the details. So we can filter. But notice something about the map and the narrative. It goes right through the skin. Propositional language is fundamentally different, a different kind of mindedness structure that maintains its informational integrity as it moves in and out of the skin, unlike subjective perspectival knowing, which is bound within the system and can't get outside of it. That's a really important point. But what does this mean definitionally? We can have significant alignment and overlap, but also differentiation in our terminology. Conscious 1 aligns with mind 1, consciousness 2 aligns with mind 2, consciousness 3, but at the same time, mindedness now, with the term, can simply allow us to bind it to the neurocognitive architecture and history of the development of animals in the world, as opposed to consciousness, which then is a broader term. So now pay attention whether you're intending to bind it to the brain-body activities, or you want to pull off it and then apply it to artificial intelligence, to aliens, or to philosophy. Those kinds of issues are fundamentally different, and the mindedness versus consciousness distinction now gives us a tool that's actually missing in the literature with any degree because we've been mind blind. So let's hone in on this thing called mind 2 in humans. It's a subjective consciousness system, phenomenal mind, to use David Chalmers' term, that we can now say with the map is boxed in between mind 1 and mind 3 in humans. It is where the hard problem is located, and it sits across an epistemological gap. What's the epistemological gap? The epistemological gap is what develops with science. Talk to Phil Goff and Galileo's error. This is the process by which Galileo, to map the physical world and make it mind independent, he identified primary qualities which could be quote unquote objectively observed and measured versus the secondary qualities which are mind dependent impressions, secondary qualities. They're not part of the equation. Of course, this is a classic dichotomy that erroneously dichotomizes and creates this core, really, arguably, of the Enlightenment gaps, the first dichotomizing move that ultimately spreads all the other dichotomies that John was brilliantly talking about. But by the way, folks, when we're talking about the hard problem, wait, that hard problem, the Galileo thing, is very different than this hard problem. That's the neurocognitive engineering problem. It's a totally different location on the map of our understanding. The neurocognitive engineering problem is the cognitive problem of how brains give rise to felt experiences in animals and humans. So that's a definitional system that enables us clarity. We can then move from a definitional system into the function and phenomenology problem. Again, the hard problem says, hey, you can't bind these two really. We have a scientific understanding of the function problem, but phenomenology, that's much harder. Actually, I'm not sure that's the case. And I think we can afford ourselves an extended phenomenology and an extended psychological functionism that creates a coherent, complexified picture of causal relevance across levels that enables us to see with, in fact, a language system and a theoretical system and a phenomenological feeling system, a sense of coherence across those different perspectives. So let's talk first about extended phenomenology. This is addressed in Essay 8. So what is Mind 2? It's a bit of a mouthful, but I really want you to kind of sink this in. Extended naturalism is characterizing mind 2 as a perspectival, John will recognize that term, a perspectival epistemic portal that functions as nature's virtual reality headset. It operates as nature's virtual reality that functions to model mindedness and can be metaphorically represented as a plasma ball. Okay? So there's a lot that's packed in here, but a perspectival. Think here, of course, of John's 4 frames of knowing. Propositional, not the same. Participatory, not the same. Procedural. It is a perspectival. What a knowing portal. A portal is a doorway, and especially that affords information interface. What does it give rise to? A virtual reality headset that then's tracking what? Mindedness. Notice you don't introspect and see your liver functioning. That's not what the headset is doing. What it is doing is tracking your behavior as an animal as a whole so you can see that lion is hunting you. That's what you're capable of doing. It's tracking mindedness. And because we haven't had the concept of mindedness, we haven't really been able to nail what actually is the representational system representing. And it's representing mind. And how does it come out of it? It's not coming out of the brain at that level. It's coming out of the neurocognitive semantic activity. So it's a higher order representation on neurocognitive semantic activity that's then going to model the self in relationship to other to extend its capacities over distance, i.e. space-time relations, so that you're going to get a thinking system that can manipulate possible behavioral investment paths based on memory and a simulated structure. It's modeling mindedness. What do I mean by represented by a plasma ball? Well, let's think about its key elements. It's an epistemic portal. It's framed by perspectival knowing via perceiving a landscape. This is the domain, okay, from a subjective point of view. So it's qualities that are perceived by a subject. An epistemic portal is a bounded cognitive field accessed by mental semantic context. You can't introspect and see your retina firing. That's what I mean in relation. What you see, have access to, is you observe other behaving creatures and yourself as a behaving entity, a minded behaving entity, not a morphologically behaving entity. And this is then the epistemic portal. You're an organism that's doing all the intelligence things, creating potentialities as a living embodied field of potential. Within that is a nervous system that's creating and then a neurocognitive architecture, that neurocognitive activity, a semantic architecture that ultimately is going to be bound together in a potential field that affords a subjective point of view on conscious contexts that are processed bottom up and top down. This is what we mean by the essence of the epistemic portal. And at some level, this is a really simple model. It's like, oh, yeah, obviously. And if you pay attention to the ways in which people analyze this through memory and attention and procedure, perception, which, by the way, I just taught in a graduate class on cognitive science, the cutting edge stuff in perception and in memory and intention is doing top down, bottom up, on a focal point in relationship to a field of attention that has explicit access out of an implicit field. Those things are, that is the frame that's available. So we can then say that there's a perspectival knowing evolution. We're going to actually, I model this. John and I talked about this and explored this. Behavioral investment theory suggests that we can model this in two major steps. There's an early binding function when the exterior sensory system gets tracked into the interior sensor that gives rise to learning. Ginsberg and Jablonka did a wonderful story about this, the evolution of the sensitive soul. Ancient Origins of Consciousness is also an excellent work on this. Work done by Damasio and Solms all point to a particular kind of emergent binding structure of perception, feeling, and reaction that gives rise to what we call valence qualia in the affective core. But that's not necessarily a subjective self perceiving interior detail that can think across time. That's where you get the evolution of the cortex, a subjective observer that's associated with what behavioral investment identifies as thinking animals when there's an opportunity to anticipate over a longer light cone and then necessarily to simulate that and create better information stored via memory. And all of this is functioning to model mindedness. There are three key elements to the epistemic portal. There's a field of conscious potential. Anybody wake up? Anybody go to sleep? Anybody been in a good mood versus a bad mood? Then you have a sense as to what the field of conscious potential is. Can you attend to particular conscious contents? Do the little duck rabbit illustration. Oh, at one level it's a duck, then it flips over to a rabbit. There are different conscious contents, and that is experienced from a subjective point of view. And this can be likened to nature's virtue. We now have the technologies to kind of see. Anil Seth calls it controlled hallucination. My preferred, I think that's potentially misleading. Others have called it a virtual reality headset. And this plasma ball representation, I think, is useful because it just speaks to, hey, there's a core, there's a field of potential conscious contents, and then if you put your finger on it, that serves as the frontal lobe attentional structure, analogous to. And these three elements do align, that's what I was pointing to, in the brain, align with a conscious field, basically subcortical operative structures that give rise to the potential for essentially qualia to be perceived, and then a cortical structure at the back of the brain that's going to integrate perceptual content, and then that perceptual content can then be pulled into the frontal lobe, which is for planning and inhibition across what's relevant either to a task or to a self. In other words, but basically put it on a timeline that affords memory, attention, and self-relevance, which is essentially the global workspace in relationship to the conscious contents. This gives rise to a core back front analysis. If we look at the core theories of consciousness that's summarized here in Anil Seth, there's higher order thought. What does that say? Hey, it says that it's a thought on a thought. Well, what we're saying is mind 2 emerges out of mind 1, not out of the brain. So mind 1 is a neurocognitive structure. So this is representing on a representation. If you want to use that word loosely, representation is a dangerous word, but we'll use it broadly and loosely. What higher order thought does not get, as what many don't, is that actually in humans then, if we're talking about human consciousness, there's actually a higher order when we start narrating. So not only is the experience of redness tracking, but it's actually a narrator on top of that. Higher order thought often has struggles, it seems in my review of the literature, in differentiating a mind 3 in human narrator, and they get in trouble about how far up the representation has to go of meta representation. Re-entry and predictive processing, basically there's a top-down, bottom-up structural function that emerges out of a predictive processing system. That's where the action of consciousness is. Integrated information is about, there's a binding structure, okay? That the core aspect of phenomenology is a binding structure. And I believe it's a very powerful, certainly the general concept of integrated information is super powerful. I think they hit on really key elements, but pay attention to what integrated information theory is really about in the time frame that they're talking. So if you listen to Giulio Tonini, he's like, oh yeah, it's like about 1/10 of a second. Okay. So the phenomenology that he's talking about in terms of conscious contents is not, hey, how was your day today? It's talking about the absolute minimum qualia events that are then getting basically processed. Ultimately, in their idea, the best integrated information processors are in the back of the brain. And you get this versus the ways in which you get access to particular ideas, you focus on them, download them, and consider it. I think there's a synergistic working between back of the brain and front of the brain, surprisingly enough. And I think what we've got with global neuronal workspace versus integrated information is two emphasis, one on the ground of conscious contents that are being perceived and integrated, and one on the subjective self that's attending to, remembering, and focusing. And in fact, I think there's a lot of emerging consensus that that's basically the way these things are getting put together in the latest cutting edge elements. And we can see here in this picture that we have front perspectives that say, hey, both of these global workspace, higher order theories, they're basically taking representations, manipulating them, broadcasting, accessing versus consolidating them. And there's a back and front relation. And there are some individuals that are emphasizing this affective core. Well, this basic model of an epistemic portal says, here's the whole system. This is how it evolved. These are the core parts. Then it evolves into cortex. The cortex is doing the back. The front's doing the back. And you have recursive processing, add the thalamus, and you have a basic structure that's given rise to the integrated informational structure at the brain level with how our phenomenological experience is offering. So, what we have then is a package that's now looking at the architecture of the neurocognitive system. I can then go talk to my friend Baron, a psychiatrist who works on the top of this, and say, hey, here it is from this level. Let's talk about this level. Then we can go talk at the cognitive level. And then we can ultimately also talk, remember where I'm coming from, Baron does too because he's a psychiatrist, but we just talk to a neuroscientist. Now I want to talk with folks in the world about their problems and about their own phenomenological experience of being. Well, extended naturalism is what affords me the capacity as a psychotherapist to listen to John and be like, yeah, John's got the right view of the philosophy of science and the architecture. And of course, he's a cognitive scientist that tells us a lot about how to be. And I can utilize that to actually also navigate how it is that I'm empathizing with the phenomenological experience of the person in the real world in front of me. That's the task that we should have a conciliant view on, or at least that's what we would strive for. And what that suggests is that I can understand phenomenology both through an empathy, through the natural attitude, we should be able to clarify that, but bridge it to a functional analysis of the various domains in an ecologically valid and transjective, and in here I would mean transjective, objectively, subjectively, and intersubjectively into a particular whole, which is complementary to John's specific focus when we hone in on, say, the agent arena or objective-subjective dialectic. There are four key elements that we're arguing for in this picture. One is the interrelationship between function and phenomenology can be more or less dissolved. It's not the same thing. But the reasons that Dave Chalmers says, hey, you can't do this is because he's looking at it precisely through a scientific materialistic lens that has a particular set of constraints on what kind of causal relations it can interpret. And that's one of the reasons. So it's a blind spot inside of science that we don't need to have via an extended natural perspective. The epistemic portal theory of mind, too, provides a rich holistic account of the phenomenal mind as nature's reality headset that can be framed via modeling mindedness and a metaphor of a plasma ball. We're going to integrate big picture frameworks that enables the key insights from the theories of consciousness to create a complexified whole. And then ultimately, the binding of our meta-theoretical systems enables us a functional explanatory structure that places these in the real world and allows an ecologically valid account of what's happening. Hey folks, guess what? I'm justifying to you what we're trying to accomplish, focusing on what's relevant and trying to realize a particular outcome. Those are the kinds of languages that we want to bring to bear in our everyday life. So we're bridging phenomenology. John did a lecture that had 6 A's. I built off of that and added a few. We want to be able to see our Mind 2 experience as being, hey, you know what? It comes online. It goes off online. It has different levels of arousal, of alertness, and awakeness. It is fundamentally constituted by a sense of awareness. It's an amalgamation experience, meaning there's a unified whole in relationship to, it's not breaking, although schizophrenia is an interesting case about where you could suggest that some of it may come apart. It's fundamentally related to attention in certain complicated, deep, and overlapping ways where I direct my attention, I become conscious of. Conscious attention seems central. It aspectualizes key elements of reality and relation, meaning I don't see, of course, the whole reality. I see only slices that I'm relevantly framing. And that gives rise to actually a much richer articulation of what qualia is, because there is qualia that binds through attention versus the conscious contents. John and I talked about that, of course, in Untangling the World Knot. it's the affective core, both of course has evaluations in relationship to what we experience, but I would argue it also creates the coloring, affective coloring of the conscious field, because it goes to the very embodiment of approach avoid and the affordances that we sit in an ecological structure. This gives rise to the angle of valence qualia and affective core. Global learner workspace, as Ned Blott, fundamentally is about access. And of course, if we think about it in terms of pragmatic terms, what do you have access to memory wise? What's on the stage of awareness in relation? What are you moving around? Access consciousness is key. And then finally, there's this whole issue, especially if we're talking about humans, of agency, this ability, that sense that I can direct and self-recursively narrate. Dan McAdams argues the self evolves, 3 more A words here, as a social actor, and then becomes at adolescence a sense of agency, like I actually can do things recursively, and then ultimately in adults I want to tell a story of my protagonist thematically in relationship to my life. What are all these A words fundamentally about? What do you mean when you're talking about consciousness, right? We want to be very clear. If we shift, though, from, hey, I mean the system of mind too, that has phenomenological relevance to us as humans, then as opposed to this very vague word consciousness, we will do a lot better. And if we utilize this lensing structure, say, of these 10 A words, we will have a phenomenologically empathetic frame for the system as a whole. But it's not just that, because we also need theoretical understanding. We're bridging, unlike Husserl, where we're not thinking in terms of just the natural attitude, completely unplugged from philosophy or psychology. Nor we're not doing a psychologicalism either. We're doing a dialectic between everyday real experiences of living that we take seriously and theories that are up to the task, ecologically valid across multiple different contexts, to emphasize what's relevant and causal explanations that can be real. And this, of course, gets us to our essay 9, our functionalism. And what I'm now calling a strong cognitive functionalism is recognizing that there's a core in cognitive psychology, cognitive science about hierarchical predictive processing. That needs to be transformed into recursive relevance realization. I'm teaching a course, graduate level course, on cognitive science right now, and that has popped for me so dramatically. I mean, obviously, I've always been a fan of John's work, but I can't believe how this bakes in a ecologically realistic appraisal of not just my behavior. I often call John the inner Skinner, but actually, because I can bind what he's doing on the outside. But now as we shift from the neurocognitive hierarchical predicting mechanism view into, oh wait, this is a recursive relevance realization, the jump from mind 1 to mind 2 at the level of ecological languaging and availability to empathize is unbelievably clear. And then once we have this as a backbone, we can place it in the evolutionary view afforded by behavioral investment theory that grounds us as understanding animals as moving around in 3D behavioral space. We are, of course, primates and care tremendously about the relational world. We can look at Tomasello, we can look at our attachment systems, we can look at how we navigate status and affiliation and the influence matrix, consolidate those. And of course, we are justifying persons. The evolution of propositional language is a radically different shift and gives rise to an entire mind on top of a mind. And if we're going to talk about human phenomenology, mind 2, we better include the fact that if we're dealing with adults, we're going to have a mind 3 on top of that. So what are we looking at here? We have a basic model of hierarchical predictive processing that grounds a huge amount. We can sophisticatedly add to that things like Friston's free energy principle. It goes a wonderful mathematics, goes right down into the biophysicality, hook up with Michael Levin. Think about it in terms of a hierarchical model, which everybody does, and then realize that we can then take this view, the architecture of this view, is embedded in a much more dynamic, and at least for our human phenomenology, much more ecologically available perspective. And John shows actually how it also goes deep, of course, into sort of the ground of intelligibility relative to the capacity to be an intelligent being. We can argue that actually the basic structure of hierarchical predictive processing has within it recursive relevance realization. What's the frame of the state? Well, in order to frame the state, you have to then bring to bear what is relevant. That is fundamentally about what's focused. Then you hone in on it to realize what it is that you're seeing, of course. And then fundamentally in the perception action loop, you're engaged in creating. And of course, the whole idea of the extended mind, 4D cognitive, is that we're not just talking about abstract representations, we're talking about animals that are perceiving action in a dynamic feedback loop. And so realization fundamentally is about circling that loop. And then guess what hierarchical processing really should be considered? It should be considered as a recursive process that spreads across multimodals, up, bottom up, and top down across the structure. So recursive relevance realization is the architecture of hierarchical predictive processing, in my view. And once we have that line, then all of a sudden we have a very deep and profound line, because we can connect that to a model of mind too that gives us a framework for understanding of, oh, the inside out view of my first person perspectival knowing is a recursive relevance realizing structure that emerges out of maybe the ground of a mechanistic predictive processing structure, perhaps. But the point is that the recursive relevance realization angle brings the epistemic portal model alive. Now, we can now place that inside of a descriptive metaphysics, understand both tree of knowledge languaging that enables us to see the layers of notice. He talked about complexification. The layers and levels of complexification come alive with periodic table behavior and tree of knowledge. We can now map that on a map of mind and see the map of mind as an epistemic perspectival portal that emerges from an interior perspective as to why it's difficult to see from the outside vantage view. We can track the development of processing from hierarchical predictive processing into recursive relevance realization that enables us to build a model of an epistemic portal inside of mammals into human beings. And then we can use the juxtaposed elements of the meta-theoretical architecture of the unified theory. Behavioral investment theory grounds it in animals in a particular way, emphasizes more the affective motivational structure, work effort, return on work effort, connects it right into Skinner. We then jump up into attachment theory, we jump up in other dimensions about social psychology, and ultimately then turn us into cultured persons that are justifying and then making cases for science that actually have real arguments to be made because of a conforming around an ontology, epistemologic, transcendent conception of knowing. What does all this mean? The hard problem of consciousness is broken. We can zoom out and see the Enlightenment gap and see the neurocognitive engineering problem. Extended naturalism gives us a theory of mind too in a system that resolves the Enlightenment gap. And that's a totally different ballgame. Thank you. We hope you guys enjoy the conference.